Is this the best gaming and sim racing CPU on the market right now? Yeah, it is, but my experience has been a bit of a roller coaster, and I wanted to share that with you guys today. There's plenty of videos out there by now benchmarking this CPU and showing just how good it is for gaming, and even some sim racing content by Dan Suzuki benchmarking them as well, and it performed great there too. And in my experience, the performance has been fantastic, but it's been a bit of a struggle to get there. My original plan was to redo my old benchmarks with the 5800X 3D and the 7950X to compare it with this new 7950X 3D, but I had lent those out or given them away, and I no longer have them. And unfortunately, I at least had the 5800X 3D, and I forgot to benchmark it before I took my computer apart. And then I put it all in a custom water loop again, and there's just no way I'm going to be able to flip-flop back and forth all the time and still be productive. So what I ended up doing was benchmarking the 7950X 3D anyways, and just kind of looking at the old benchmarks in comparison to it. But this isn't really a good accurate representation because those benchmarks were done 4 months ago. There's been different BIOS changes, chipset driver changes, and even GPU driver changes. So I wasn't going to give it as a one-to-one comparison, but I just kind of wanted to see what the ballpark idea was and see if there was any real difference, even though it's not the most scientific test. But plus, there's plenty of benchmark videos. I more so wanted to share my experience with the chip because, like I said earlier, it was kind of a roller coaster to get it working properly. To give you a rundown of what makes the 7950X 3D interesting is the 3D V cache. And what we've learned from the 5800X 3D is that games, at least some games, really like this extra cache, and it can substantially increase performance. Simulation titles like sim racing tend to be some of the use cases that really benefit from this. Now, what separates the 7950X 3D from the 5800X 3D is obviously it's a new platform, newer chip, but it's also a 16-core chip versus a 8-core chip. And with the 7950X 3D, those 16 cores are split into two smaller chiplets of 8 cores each, and only one of those chiplets has the extra V cache, and the other doesn't. Whereas the 5800X 3D is just one chiplet, and basically all the cores of the 5800X 3D have the V cache. So the idea with the 7950X 3D is you have one V-cache chiplet that's great for certain applications and gaming, and then for the games or applications that don't benefit from the 3D V-cache, you have the other 8 cores that can boost higher since they don't have the V-cache basically limits how much the core clock can boost. So because it doesn't have that, it can actually boost higher. So you have one side that's high frequency cores and then the V-cache cores. So it's supposed to be like the best of both worlds and be able to switch between what's best for the best situation. So in theory, this sounds perfect. I mean, you get the best of both worlds, right? But the problem is we're kind of reliant on software and Windows to make sure it's all working right, which, as we know with Windows, can not be working right all the time. So to cut to the chase, one of the benefits about the AMD platform is that the idea is that you're basically able to just update the BIOS, pop in the new chip, update some drivers, and you're good to go. Perfect, brand new performance, easy peasy. Well, unfortunately, I wasn't having great performance when I did this. I used my same Windows 11 that I had installed when I did my original 7950X. And then so I just updated my BIOS, did all my updates. And for the 7950X 3D, those updates not only include the BIOS and the chipset driver, but we also need the Xbox game bar updated to the latest version, because that's how it knows when to be in the game mode or use the V cache. So that's another important one. So I did all those, and my performance was pretty lackluster compared to what I was seeing online. In other reviews, I was seeing Cinebench R23 scores of around 35 to even 37,000, where I was getting like 32 or 33. And even when trying different games and benchmarking those, my performance was pretty bad and just something wasn't working right. So I did some research and I did some reading, and I saw a Reddit post say that AMD recommends a new Windows install from scratch. So I was like, all right, I guess I'll bite the bullet and I'll do it. So I did that and my performance was definitely better. It still was getting kind of weaker scores compared to the other Cinebench scores that I was seeing online, but after I did a enabled PBO and did a curve optimizer offset for every core and enabled Expo 2 for the RAM speeds, I was at best I got about a 36k or a little above 36k Cinebench score, so I was happy enough with that, and my gaming performance was much better. And when I would check in Resource Monitor, it was correctly parking the non-Vcache cores, so basically like turning those off and only using the Vcache cores in gaming, so that was working as intended with the Windows selecting, which application for which. I tested several different games, sim racing and non-sim racing games, and it seems to be working decently well. I didn't think I had any issues. And I do think in what applications you're doing, it can be a bit temperamental. I've seen other people have to use like process lasso and some extra steps to get certain applications to work as intended. So it does feel like being this early, we are kind of beta testers, but that's just what it means to be on the bleeding edge, right? All right, so now we'll get into my experience with my sim racing setup. It's triple 4K 120Hz monitors, which you would think is mostly just GPU bound scenarios, but being sim titles are very CPU process heavy. The CPU still matters very much, even when we're rendering almost 26 million pixels. And the one big issue that I was still trying to solve with my setup was low frame rates in iRacing race starts. I didn't used to race iRacing all that much, but in the last couple months, it's become my main sim. And in the benchmarks that I did before, it wasn't varied enough because the game is really old and the engine's really old, so performance on track and situations can vary extremely. And in those old benchmarks, I just had it at the max quality preset, but in real world use, I used a bit different settings, and even then, the performance would still vary, especially on race starts. So I've been using the 5800X3D because I lent out my 7950X, and my race starts were dropping as low as 40 to 50 FPS in some certain track situations. And at that point, that's like really bad. But I will admit there was one setting that I could have boosted my FPS a little bit that I wasn't running. That was the SMP projection setting. It kind of scares you when you read it. It's like, oh, you'll be missing graphical effects. Your FOV will be more limited. So I was like, oh, I don't want that. But I haven't noticed really a difference with using that, and it does increase performance a bit. So I would definitely recommend that. But that wasn't enough to get me where I wanted to be. So at least for triple screens, the 5800X3D wasn't really cutting it for my use case, and I definitely wanted a little bit more power, especially when I was seeing how many frames my buddy with a 13900K was getting. So this friend and I have a bit of a rivalry. He's Team Blue and I'm Team Red on pretty much everything right down to our sim rigs. And I don't like losing to him in a race or having less FPS, so I had to do something about it. And the 7950X3D delivered and put me back on top.
You are the best.
We pretty much have identical setups other than the processors, so we did some testing at Sebring in an AI race to see how much a performance difference was between each other. And with 40 AI cars on Sebring at 7 a.m., I was getting anywhere from between 10 and 20 FPS more than him. Yes. I don't remember the exact numbers, but before on the 5800X3D, I was getting a little bit less performance than him versus his 13900K. So the bump from the 5800X3D was even larger than the bump already over the 13900K, so I was super happy about that. And to see this amount of performance jump while rendering almost 25 million pixels is extremely impressive. Before I got the CPU, I was contemplating on maybe going back down to 1440p just to have a smoother experience. But after getting the CPU, I've been extremely happy, and I feel like I can have my cake and eat it too. I was even really shocked to see a 10 FPS increase in a Assetto Corsa Competizione AI race, because I was expecting no difference there, being that it's so GPU graphically intensive, but really pleased to see that. Although, once again, we are comparing that to an old benchmark, so take it with a grain of salt. But that's kind of where my excitement ended, because even though I shouldn't compare to the old benchmarks, I still wanted to see if I was, somewhere in the ballpark or maybe a little bit better or something like that. And the performance was actually either the same to actually worse. And I was really surprised by that. Typically, I was seeing about the same FPS, maybe sometimes a little bit better or just slightly worse, but I was overall seeing a trend of worse 1% lows, which was actually kind of surprising because when I was using the CPU in like iRacing, one of the things I really noticed was like, wow, this feels like it stutters way less. It feels way smoother. So my 1% lows should, I would think, be much better than they were before. And I'll show all the different benchmarks I did, but I wouldn't read it too much into them comparing to the old ones because, like I said, I'd have to redo the old ones to really know for sure what the performance is like. But it did hurt me a little. I have to kind of ignore it and just appreciate my much better race stars than iRacing. Now, what was really disappointing was looking at the VR performance. VR is an area where the 3D Vcache should actually really excel and get better performance than ever compared to any other chip. And it wasn't really the case when I was looking at the benchmarks. My frame rates were about the same, but once again, pretty much around the board, my 1% lows were worse. So this had me digging around, and one thing that's important with the 7950X3D is that the Windows power plan is set to balanced and not high performance. When you set it to high performance, the Windows scheduler doesn't work properly with the 7950X3D to pick the right chiplet for the right job. Now, knowing that, one thing I noticed was SteamVR actually changes the Windows power plan to high performance instead of balanced. So this is forcing the high frequency cores to render the game instead of the 3D Vcache cores. So I changed the power plan back to balance, which, by the way, you would have to do every time you boot up SteamVR. And even then, I still wasn't really getting any better or worse performance. It was actually some titles, it maybe did like a couple frames better and maybe slightly higher on the 1% lows, or once again, maybe ever so slightly worse. It was pretty much kind of like same overall. Now, I'm not sure if in the last 4 months, if the BIOS changes or the Windows changes or if game updates or driver updates have significantly lowered performance for all chips across the board, or if I actually have something going on with my chip. I really don't have any idea until I can test more again. But I at least know from doing benchmarks against my buddy's 13900K and comparing games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Cyberpunk benchmarks to other YouTube benchmarks that I've seen, that my performance, at least in those, has been either the same or better. So I think it's performing like it should, but I don't know. But at this point, I don't even like VR anymore. I'm not a VR testing expert, so I'm happy with my triple screens. I'm just going to go back there and completely forget about it. So after losing my mind through the frustrating experiences that is benchmarking sim racing titles, and it's really not fun, I'm telling you, I don't want to do it anymore. But what would I recommend? And for my use cases, I'm actually really happy with the chip. It's been working pretty much effortlessly for me now. In terms of just using the computer and driving on iRacing, everything seems to be pretty good. And since I do a lot of video editing on the channel, it makes sense for me to get the 7950X3D for the extra workstation power. But if you are just gaming or just sim racing, then I honestly would stay far away from the CPU and just wait for the 7800X3D that's coming out soon. And the reason that is like the 5800X3D, it's only an 8-core processor, so all the cores on it are going to have the Vcache, so it's not going to have any Windows scheduler, finicky software issues. It should be a much more just straight up normal CPU, easy experience. And because it's only that one chiplet and it doesn't have to figure anything out, you might actually get even better performance than the 7950X3D. And on top of that, it's going to be cheaper. So less money and less problems. I mean, yeah, that's definitely the way to go, I think. Now, if you're on the AM4 platform and you still haven't gotten a 5800X3D, then what are you doing? Because that chip is still very, very good, especially for VR users. I mean, the VR performance on that is absolutely perfect, I think. Whereas maybe on triple screens, you can justify going to the AM5 platform because the newer chips do slightly better on triples. But even then, the 5800X killer deal, you can just pop it in your motherboard, do a BIOS update, and you're done. No need to have to replace your RAM, motherboard, all that. It's 5800. I love that chip. It's great. I apologize this video isn't as analytically detailed as I would have liked it to be since I wasn't able to do those fresh benchmarks. Being that I'm using my primary PC and I don't have test benches, and I used to be all completely custom water looped with hard lines, doing all this testing was very difficult, causing a lot of downtime for me, and it's just been really difficult to be as in-depth as I would really like to be. But I still wanted to share my overall experience with the new 3D chip. Perhaps in the future I might get my hands on a 7800X 3D, but no promises there. But if I do, perhaps I'll be able to do some more vigorous testing in the future. You might have to hold me at gunpoint to agree to that, though. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments down below, or you can join my Discord if you want to have a more in-depth discussion, and I'll leave that in the description down below as well. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe if you'd like to see some more tech and sim racing content. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.